At 11:25 in the evening on November 13, 1985, a sound arrives in the town of Armero that no one has a word for. It is not thunder, it is not wind, it is lower than both, a vibration more felt than heard, coming from the direction of the Lagunitas River Valley to the east, growing in the way that a wave grows as it approaches the shore, except that it does not stop. It keeps building, and with it comes the smell of sulfur and mud and something organic, something ancient, something that has no place in a sleeping town in the Colombian lowlands at 11:30 on a Wednesday night. Most of the 28,700 people who live in Armero are in their beds. The town has been through hours of ashfall, rain, and radio advisories telling residents to remain calm. The mayor has said to stay calm. The civil defense coordinator has said to stay calm. The radio station that broadcasts to the town has said to stay calm. And so the town has stayed calm, as it has been instructed to, and the ash has been falling for weeks in the way ash sometimes falls near volcanoes. And people have grown used to it the way people grow used to anything that does not immediately kill them. The sound is 3 minutes away from Armero when it can first be heard. By the time anyone understands what it is, Armero has 2 minutes left. The lahar, the volcanic mud flow that has been traveling down the Lagunitas River Valley for approximately 90 minutes, since the eruption of Nevado del Ruiz high in the Andes above, since the volcanic heat melted the glacial ice and mixed it with the pyroclastic material from the summit, since the resulting torrent gathered the sediment of river valleys and grew into a wall of saturated debris more than 30 meters. High moving at speeds of up to 50 kilometers per hour, arrives in Armero at 11:28 in the evening and buries it in a matter of minutes. By morning, 23,000 of the 28,700 residents of Armero are dead. The warning that could have emptied the city was written 6 weeks before the lahar arrived. This is the story of a map that showed exactly what would happen. A prediction that was made and ignored. A city full of people who were told to stay calm by officials who knew, or should have known, that calm was the wrong instruction. It is a story about the gap between scientific warning and institutional action that is, 4 decades later, still not fully closed in Colombia or anywhere else. And it is a story about what a lahar actually is. Why even a relatively small volcanic eruption can produce one of the deadliest natural disasters of the 20th century, and why the physics of what happened above Armero that night was not a surprise to anyone who had been reading the instruments. If this kind of deep, real science holds your attention, take a second to like and subscribe. The map was drawn. The warning was issued. 23,000 people died anyway. Let's begin. To understand what happened to Armero, you have to understand what Nevado del Ruiz is. It is not the largest volcano in the Andes. It is not the most historically active. It sits at approximately 5,321 meters elevation in the central Cordillera of Colombia, straddling the departments of Caldas and Tolima. Permanently snow-covered and glaciated at its summit, looming above river valleys that drain west and east from the high peaks into the lowlands where Colombian agriculture, coffee, cotton, livestock built the prosperity of the region below. The town of Armero sat 74 kilometers to the northwest of the summit, in the valley of the Lagunitas River, at an elevation of approximately 330 meters above sea level. The difference in elevation between the summit and Armero is roughly 5,000 meters. That vertical drop across 74 kilometers of river valley is the physical geography that made Armero catastrophically vulnerable. Nevado del Ruiz has erupted before. The historical record of Colombian colonization documents an eruption in 1595 that sent a lahar down the Lagunitas Valley that killed approximately 100 people in the indigenous and colonial settlements of the time. Another eruption in 1845 sent a lahar down the same valley that killed an estimated 1,000 people in a different set of settlements that had grown up in the decades since. The 1845 lahar destroyed a community called Ambalema and severely damaged Armero's own precursor settlements. The river valley below Ruiz is a documented lahar corridor, a geographic feature that does what it does when the volcano above it erupts, repeatedly, across centuries, following the same drainage pathways down the same valley system into the same lowland terrain. Armero was built in this corridor in 1895. Its founders did not know about the 1595 lahar. Knowledge of the 1845 lahar had not been systematically compiled and was not part of the institutional knowledge of the community's founders. Armero was not built in ignorance of geology because its founders understood geology and dismissed the risk. It was built in ignorance of geology because the geological record of prior events had not been preserved and transmitted in any form that reached the people making decisions about where to build. The town grew for 90 years in a hazard zone that had killed people twice in the 3 preceding centuries, and no one living in the town in 1985 had been given a clear account of that history by any government, school, or institution responsible for their safety. The October 1985 hazard map was the first document in Armero's history that explicitly placed the city in a documented volcanic risk zone and projected the specific mechanism lahar from the Lagunitas River that would kill it. It arrived 6 weeks before the eruption. It was not followed by any community communication program that would have put its content in front of the 28,700 people it described as being in the highest risk zone. The map was drawn, the warning was issued, the town was not told. The volcano above it had been quiet for 69 years. In late 1984, it stopped being quiet. Seismic activity around the summit of Nevado del Ruiz began increasing in November 1984. In Geominas, the Instituto Nacional de Investigaciones Geológico-Mineras, the Colombian government agency responsible for geological monitoring, detected the increase in its network of seismometers and began expanding its monitoring. The signals were consistent with the movement of magma or volcanic fluids in the subsurface, small, shallow earthquakes occurring in swarms. The characteristic microseismicity of a restless volcanic system, not an emergency signal by itself, a monitoring signal. The kind of thing that is supposed to trigger enhanced observation and planning, not immediate alarm. Through 1985, the signals escalated. On March 22, 1985, Nevado del Ruiz produced a phreatic eruption, a steam-driven explosion caused by groundwater or glacial meltwater flashing to steam on contact with hot volcanic material that deposited ash on the summit and surrounding areas and melted a portion of the glacial ice cap. The eruption sent a small lahar down the Azufrado River on the mountain's eastern flank. No one died. The lahar was small, but it was a direct demonstration, visible and measurable, of the mechanism that would kill Armero 7 months later. The volcano had shown what it was capable of doing, in miniature, before the main event. The question of whether anyone drew the full lesson from that demonstration is central to understanding the disaster that followed. After March 1985, the scientific attention to Ruiz increased dramatically. The Colombian government requested assistance from international volcanological organizations. Scientists from the United States Geological Survey, from the University of Arizona, and from other institutions with expertise in volcanic hazard assessment traveled to Colombia to assist in Geominas with its monitoring and hazard evaluation. A joint Colombian international team of volcanologists spent weeks studying the volcano's behavior, reviewing the historical record of prior eruptions, mapping the glacier extent, and modeling the lahars that a significant eruption would generate. Their work produced a document that should have changed everything. In October 1985, 6 weeks before the catastrophic eruption, Ingiominas published a volcanic hazard map of the Nevado del Ruiz region. The map showed the volcano at the center and projected, in color-coded zones of decreasing severity, the areas most at risk from lava flows, pyroclastic flows, ashfall, and prominently, in the zone of highest hazard lahars. The lahar hazard zones on the map followed the river valleys that drain from the summit. They followed the Lagunitas River Valley northeast from the summit. The Lagunitas River Valley runs through the location of Armero. On the October 1985 hazard map, Armero sits inside the zone colored for the highest lahar risk. The map was not ambiguous. It did not use cautious language that might leave the implication uncertain. It showed, in the visual language of color-coded hazard cartography, that Armero was the most dangerous place within the reach of the volcano's potential lahars. The map was distributed to Colombian government officials at the regional and national level. It was presented to civil defense authorities. It was discussed in meeting. A journalist who reviewed the map reportedly described it, in a Colombian newspaper, as a map of death, a phrase that conveys both the accuracy of the document's content and the degree to which the content was understood by at least some people who saw it. The map did not produce an evacuation plan. The map did not produce emergency simulations. It did not produce designated assembly points for Armero's residents or identification of evacuation routes, or a protocol specifying which authority would make the call to order evacuation and under what conditions. It produced meetings. It produced acknowledgement that the situation was being monitored. It produced official statements that the situation was being taken seriously. And in the 7 weeks between the publication of the map and the eruption of November 13, no government authority with jurisdiction over Armero issued instructions to residents about what to do if the volcano erupted. To understand why this happened, you have to understand both the human architecture of the warning failure and the geological architecture of the lahar. What is a lahar? The word comes from the Javanese language, from Indonesia, where volcanic mudflows have been a persistent feature of the inhabited landscape for as long as the island has been inhabited and documented. A lahar is not lava. It is not a pyroclastic flow, the superheated gas and ash avalanche that moves at hurricane speed down a volcano's flanks. It is not an ash cloud. It does not glow. It does not look, from a distance or in the dark, like anything a person without specific geological knowledge would recognize as a threat coming from a volcano. A lahar is a mixture of volcanic material rock fragments, pumice, ash, and water, in proportions and quantities sufficient to create a viscous, rapidly moving slurry that behaves physically like wet concrete. It is denser than water. It is heavier than river floodwater by a factor of 2 to 3. It carries debris boulders the size of houses, mature trees, concrete structures, vehicles the way a river in flood carries sticks and leaves, except that the objects it carries are vastly larger and the force behind them is correspondingly greater. A lahar that encounters a building does not push the building aside. It does not simply flood it with a meter of water that can be cleaned up afterward. It engulfs the building in a mixture so dense and heavy that the building collapses under the lateral force of the flow, and the collapsed material is incorporated into the debris load and carried forward with the rest of it. The character of a lahar, how fast it moves, how far it travels, how destructive it is, depends critically on 2 variables: the volume of water available to mix with the volcanic material, and the gradient of the channel system it travels through. In river valleys with steep upper reaches and relatively flat lower reaches, which describes the Lagunillas river system below Nevado del Ruiz, a lahar accelerates in the upper portion, where the gradient is steep, picks up its maximum debris load, and then spreads out as the gradient flattens in the lowlands, slowing but becoming broader. A lahar that is moving at 50 kilometers per hour in a confined, steep-sided channel may spread across several kilometers of flat lowland terrain when it exits the confinement of the upper valley. Armero sat on the flat lowland plain at the base of the Lagunillas Valley. The lahar had been channeled and concentrated by the geometry of the upper valley through its entire transit. When it reached Armero, it spread across the city's entire footprint simultaneously. The source of the water in a lahar determines the scale of the lahar, and this is the mechanism that made Nevado del Ruiz so specifically dangerous relative to volcanoes of similar eruption magnitude. Nevado del Ruiz, at its 1985 extent, had approximately 25 square kilometers of glacial ice covering its summit and upper flanks. In volume terms, the ice cap held billions of liters of frozen water accumulated over centuries of snowfall and glacial compression in direct thermal contact with the volcanic material of the summit cone. The ice was not isolated from the volcano. It sat on volcanic rock. Its base was in contact with the heat of a system that had been warming for more than a year of increasing unrest. When the November 13 eruption delivered hot pyroclastic material onto the ice cap and sent hot gases and tephra flows across the glaciated summit, the heat transfer into the ice was rapid and enormous. The eruption itself was, by the standards of volcanic eruptions, relatively modest, a volcanic explosivity index of 3, which is equivalent to a moderate explosive eruption. Smaller than many eruptions that do not kill anyone because they occur in uninhabited terrain. The eruption did not melt all of Nevado del Ruiz's ice. It melted approximately 10% of it, approximately 2.5 square kilometers of glacial ice, converted to water in a matter of minutes, mixing with the volcanic debris of the summit and the sediment of the river channels as it descended. 10% of the ice cap of Nevado del Ruiz, released as liquid water in a matter of minutes, was enough to bury a city of 28,700 people. This is the specific ratio that makes ice-capped volcanoes so uniquely dangerous compared to volcanic systems of similar eruptive power. A non-glaciated volcano of equivalent VE3 eruptive magnitude might send pyroclastic flows down its immediate flanks and deposit ash across a broad area. But it would not generate a lahar capable of reaching a city 74 kilometers away at fatal scale. A glaciated volcano of the same eruptive magnitude converts its ice cap into a delivery mechanism that extends its lethal reach far beyond what the eruption alone would project. Think of it as the difference between a fire that burns where it starts and a fire that melts a water tower sitting above a city, releasing the water to carry the fire's debris down every street simultaneously. The eruption is. The glacier is the water tower. The lahar is what happens when both occupy the same mountain. The lahar in the Lagunillas system was not the only lahar generated by the November 13 eruption. 4 major lahars traveled down different drainage systems from the Ruiz summit that night. The Azufrado River lahar was the second largest. Smaller flows entered the Molinos, Nereidas, and other tributaries, but the Lagunillas lahar was the largest, traveled the longest distance, and had the greatest population in its path. Its characteristics have been reconstructed in meticulous detail in the post-disaster scientific literature. An initial surge wave approximately 30 to 40 meters deep at peak moving at 50 kilometers per hour through the constrained, arriving at Armero carrying an estimated 90 million cubic meters of water and debris. 90 million cubic meters. Imagine the volume of 36,000 Olympic swimming pools, moving as a coherent mass at highway speed through a sleeping city. The physics of the Lahar transit from summit to Armero is documented with precision in the post-event scientific analysis. The eruption began at approximately 9:09 p.m. The initial phreatic and magmatic explosions deposited pyroclastic material on the ice cap within minutes. Meltwater began entering the river channels almost immediately. The Lahar in the Lagunitas system was coalescing as a coherent flow before 9:30 p.m. It moved down the valley at varying speeds depending on channel geometry, faster in the steep confined sections of the upper Andes, slower and broader where the valley widened, averaging roughly 50 kilometers per hour. The travel time from the summit ice cap to the outskirts of Armero was approximately 2 hours and 15 minutes. 2 hours and 15 minutes is not an inconsequential window. It is not a lot of time. But it is enough for a fully prepared and practiced community with a clear warning protocol, designated evacuation routes, and a population that understood the nature of the threat and trusted the authorities issuing the warning. 2 hours and 15 minutes is enough time to move the majority of an ambulatory population to high ground outside the Lahar hazard zone. Japanese coastal communities have demonstrated that a prepared population can reach designated tsunami high ground assembly points within 20 to 30 minutes of a warning signal. The evacuation of communities threatened by Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991, which stands as the most successful large-scale volcanic evacuation in history, moved more than 70. 00 owned people out of the hazard zone in the days before the June 15 eruption, based on scientific warnings that were both accurate and acted upon by both the government and the public. 2 hours and 15 minutes in a community that knows what a Lahar is, that has walked its evacuation routes, that has designated high ground clearly identified and trusted, is survivable time. Armero did not have any of that. It had not been given any of that. The October 1985 hazard map had identified the threat. It had not been followed by evacuation planning, community education, route designation, or assembly point identification. The knowledge that a Lahar could reach Armero existed in the hazard map and in the minds of the scientists who produced it. It had not been transmitted into the practical preparedness of the community that would need to act on it. Armero did not have a prepared population. It did not have a clear warning protocol. And the authorities responsible for issuing an evacuation order did not issue one. On the morning of November 13, 1985, Nevado del Ruiz was doing what it had been doing for months, but more intensely. Seismic activity under the summit had been elevated for days. Ash had been falling on communities downwind of the volcano since early November. A group of scientists monitoring the volcano from an observation post at a location called La Margarita on the lower slopes had been tracking the escalating signals and were in communication with officials in Manizales, the capital of Caldas Department, and with the National Civil Defense Authorities. At approximately 3 p.m. on November 13, a monitoring station detected a significant increase in sulfur dioxide emissions from the summit, a signal associated with fresh magma reaching shallow depths. The scientists at the La Margarita observation post considered this a significant escalation and communicated their concern immediately to regional civil defense authorities. At approximately 5 p.m., a meeting of regional officials in Ibagu, the capital of Tolima, was convened to discuss the situation. The meeting produced no evacuation order. At approximately 7 p.m., ash began falling more heavily on Armero. residents who stepped outside could smell the sulfur that the volcanic gases carried. The ash was not alarming in itself. Ash had been falling on and off for weeks. But the sulfur smell was stronger than it had been on prior evenings, and several residents who were interviewed in the post-disaster period recalled feeling a heightened unease that they did not act on because the radio was still telling them the situation was being monitored and they should remain calm. At approximately 7:30 p.m., the president of the Tolima Red Cross chapter, Armero Red Cross leader Graciela Salcedo, was in contact with officials who had access to the latest volcanic monitoring data. What she learned, the specific content of those communications, is not fully documented, but she acted on it immediately. She began warning people in her immediate vicinity to leave Armero. She drove to the local radio station and asked for airtime to broadcast an evacuation warning to the city. The station manager told her he had been instructed by civil defense authorities to broadcast calming messages. He declined to give her the microphone for an evacuation warning. Salcedo went back out into the streets. She warned neighbors. She helped several families load their vehicles and leave the city. She did not stop. But one person moving through a city of 28,700 on foot and by car in a dark, ash-falling night can reach only a tiny fraction of the population in the time available. At 9:09 p.m., Nevado del Ruiz erupted in its main phase. The eruption column reached approximately 27 kilometers into the stratosphere, a height that placed it in the range of globally significant volcanic events. Pyroclastic flows, avalanches of hot gas and fragmented rock, moving at several hundred kilometers per hour, swept down the summit flanks and across the glaciated ice cap. The heat of those flows, combined with the hot volcanic gases that preceded them, began converting ice to meltwater at a rate that observers later estimated in the millions of liters per minute. At 9:30 p.m., the lahars were forming. Not one lahar. 4 major lahars entering 4 different drainage systems simultaneously. The Azufrado River lahar, the second largest, was moving north. The Lagunas River lahar, the largest, was moving northwest. The others were moving in their respective directions. Each was following the gravitational inevitability of the valley system it had entered. There was no choice involved. No randomness, no possibility that the lahar might go a different way. The hazard map from October had shown exactly these drainage paths. The map showed them correctly. In the town of Armero, the radio was still broadcasting. A civil defense official named Ram Baquero, who was on air in the hours following the eruption's detection, later recalled telling listeners to remain calm and that the situation was being monitored. He recalled not knowing whether a lahar had been generated. He recalled not knowing what to tell people to do. He told them to stay calm because he did not know what else to tell them, and because he had been given no protocol for what to say in this situation, and because in the absence of a protocol, the instruction that avoids panic is the instruction that a civil defense official defaults to. At 10:30 p.m., the lahar in the Lagunas River was approximately 30 kilometers from Armero. At this point, a person standing at the edge of the flow in the upper valley and equipped with a radio transmitter could have called Armero and bought 30 to 40 minutes of warning time. The upper valley was not equipped with observers who had radio transmitters. The lahar detection infrastructure that would have been needed to provide real-time warning of the flow's progress through the river channel did not exist. At 11 p.m., the lahar was 15 to 20 kilometers from Armero, moving at speed, carrying everything the upper valley had put into it over the previous hour and a half of transit, 30 meters deep in the narrowest sections of the channel, growing in volume as it picked up additional sediment and water from the riverbed. In Armero, most people were in their beds. At 11:05 p.m., the town's electrical power began flickering. Ash and moisture had been accumulating on electrical infrastructure. Some streetlights went dark. A few residents came to their doors to look out. They saw darkness and ash and heard rain. The sound that would eventually identify itself as the lahar was not yet audible at street level. At approximately 11:10 p.m., the local radio station lost its transmitter. The cause was either electrical surge from the ash-laden atmosphere or the leading edge of the flow reaching infrastructure at the edge of town. The last thing many Armero residents heard from the radio before it went silent was the instruction to remain calm. The silence of the radio station was, in retrospect, the last warning Armero received. It was not understood as a warning. Electrical outages during storms were not uncommon. The silence was simply silence. At 11:28 p.m., the lahar reached the edge of Armero. It did not arrive the way a flood arrives as rising water that gives people time to move to upper floors, to call out to neighbors to make a final decision. A lahar at full flow velocity arrives as a wall. The front of the Lagunia's lahar, carrying 90 million cubic meters of debris at highway speed, entered the western edge of Armero with a sound that survivors in the outer margin of the flow described as an enormous roar. A sound unlike anything they had words for. The smell arrived first volcanic sulfur, mud, and the organic decomposition of everything the lahar had picked up in 2 hours of transit through the river valley above. Buildings in the direct channel path of the flow were demolished in seconds, not damaged. Demolished, the structural force of that volume of moving material at that velocity does not leave walls. It removes structures from their foundations and incorporates the debris into the flow. Buildings on the outer margins of the flow, where the lahar was spreading laterally as it exited the channel confinement of the upper valley, were partially submerged rather than demolished. Their upper floors rose above the surface of the debris field, trapping survivors in the dark above a cooling, setting, hardening surface that was becoming more solid with every passing hour. The mud that buried Armero set. This is the detail that determined who could be rescued and who could not. Unlike river flood water, which drains and leaves recoverable terrain, lahar debris compacts and hardens over hours into a material with the consistency of poorly mixed cement. People who were partially submerged and alive when rescuers reached them were frequently unable to be extracted, because removing the debris that held them risked collapse of surrounding material or pressure injuries from the release. The physical chemistry of lahar solidification killed people who survived the initial flow and were found alive in the hours and days following. The first wave the debris laid in front of the flow moved through the town in buildings that were in the direct path of the channel were engulfed and demolished. Buildings on the outer edges of the flow path were partially submerged, their upper floors visible above the mud, trapping survivors in the dark above a surface of hardening debris. The mud that buried Armero was not the thin, watery consistency of a river flood. It was thick, heavy, and it set over the following hours into a near-solid material that prevented people trapped beneath or partially within it from extracting themselves. The image that became the face of Armero's disaster was a 13-year-old girl named Omaira Sanchez. She was found by rescue workers in the early hours of November 14, in the ruins of what had been her family's home in the middle of the city. The lahar had demolished the structure and flooded the interior. Omaira was trapped to the waist, some accounts say to the chest, in the mixture of water, mud, and debris that had filled the collapsed interior of the house. Beneath the water, pinning her legs, were the walls of her own home and in some reconstructions of what rescue workers found, the body of her aunt, who had died in the collapse. The debris and water that held Armero could not be removed without the risk of catastrophic pressure change. The weight of the material bearing down on her legs had created a hydraulic condition. Removing the material would equalize the pressure and potentially cause a hemorrhage that would kill her faster than the cold and hypothermia that were already doing their slow work. Rescue workers who arrived, including local volunteers, Red Cross personnel, and eventually foreign disaster relief teams, assessed the situation and found no extraction method that did not carry a high probability of killing her faster than leaving her in place. They stayed with her. Journalists stayed with her. For nearly 60 hours, Armero Sánchez was conscious, lucid, and visible to the world. She was photographed and filmed. She talked to the people around her. She expressed concern about missing her school exams. She asked for water. She sang. She prayed. The footage of her filmed in the first hours, when she was still relatively, shows a girl who understood her situation with a clarity that was more composed than almost anyone standing around her. The French photojournalist Frank Fournier arrived in Armero on November 15 and photographed Armero in the mud. The photograph her face above the water, her eyes large and dark, a tire visible behind her head. The muddy gray surface, extending in all directions, was transmitted to news agencies and appeared on front pages around the world. It won the World Press Photo of the Year for 19. It became almost immediately a symbol not just of the Armero disaster, but of the preventability of large-scale natural disaster mortality, of what happens when warnings exist and institutions fail to act on them. Armero Sánchez died on the morning of November 16, 1985, 60 hours after the Lahar reached Armero. The direct cause of death was gangrenous infection and hypothermia. She was 13 years old. The photograph of Armero, taken by Frank Fournier, provoked international controversy after the disaster. Some argued that the journalists who remained with her and photographed her for 2 days bore moral responsibility for her death, that the time and resources spent photographing should have been spent on extraction. Others argued that the photograph was itself the most powerful possible advocacy for the conditions that had produced the disaster, that it put a human face on a failure of institutions, and that the global attention it drew contributed to the political pressure that produced improvements in volcanic hazard management in the following years. Both arguments contain some. What is not arguable is that the October 1985 hazard map placed Armero Sánchez's neighborhood in the highest risk Lahar zone and projected, accurately, that a Lahar from Nevado del Ruiz would pass through it. The map was correct. The consequences of not acting on the map were photographed for 60 hours and transmitted to the entire world. The total death toll from the November 13 Lahar was approximately 25,000 people. Of those, approximately 23,000 died in Armero. The remaining deaths were distributed across smaller communities also in Lahar hazard zones, along the other drainage systems from the summit. The town of Chinchina, downstream in the Claro River Valley on the western flank of the volcano, lost approximately 1,000 people. The Lahar that reached Chinchina was the smaller Azufrado River flow. It killed 1,000 people because the community was also in the hazard zone and also had no evacuation plan in place. The 1985 Nevado del Ruiz disaster remains the second deadliest volcanic disaster in the 20th century, after the 1902 eruption of Mount Pelée in Martinique, which killed approximately 30,000 people when a pyroclastic flow destroyed the city of Saint-Pierre. The difference between Armero and Saint-Pierre is that Saint-Pierre was killed by a mechanism, a laterally directed pyroclastic flow of a type called a new ardente that had not been observed or described in modern volcanology before it happened. The scientists monitoring Pele in 1902 could not predict what they had never seen. Armero was killed by a mechanism that the October 1985 hazard map had correctly predicted, on a pathway the map had correctly identified, in a city that the map had correctly placed in the highest risk zone. St. Pierre was a scientific failure. Armero was an institutional failure. The distinction is important because the lesson from each is different. The lesson from St. Pierre is that science must improve its understanding of volcanic behavior. The lesson from Armero is that the science was already right. The problem was not knowledge. It was decision. The question that the post-disaster scientific and governmental investigations asked, and that the families of the 23,000 dead asked, and that volcanologists around the world asked, was not whether the eruption could have been predicted. It clearly had been. The question was why the prediction failed to produce action. The investigations revealed a failure distributed across multiple levels simultaneously. Understanding that distribution is important because it is the same distribution that appears in subsequent disasters: Montserrat in 1997, the Soufriere Hills eruption that killed 19 people in the exclusion zone, Nyiragongo in 2002, Merapi in 2010, where the warning existed and the response was incomplete. It is a pattern, not a series of independent failures. At the scientific level, the monitoring was genuine and the hazard assessment was accurate. The October 1985 hazard map was correct. It would be correct again if drawn today on the same methodology. The scientists who produced it communicated their findings through appropriate channels to government officials at both regional and national level. There was no scientific failure in the Armero disaster. The failure was not in the knowledge. It was entirely in what the institutions did with the knowledge. At the institutional level, the structures for translating scientific warning into government action were inadequate to the point of non-existence. Colombia in 1985 did not have a national volcanic emergency plan. It did not have pre-established protocols specifying which authority at which level of government held the responsibility for ordering evacuation of communities in a volcanic hazard zone, and under what measurable criteria that decision would be made. The scientists could produce a hazard map. They could not order an evacuation. They had no legal authority to do so, and no mechanism through which their assessment automatically triggered a government decision. Only government civil defense authorities could order an evacuation. Those authorities were receiving the scientific information and had no framework for converting it into a mandatory decision with a specific threshold. This is the institutional gap that the post-Armero disaster management community has spent 4 decades trying to close with pre-agreed decision trees, trigger-based protocols, and clear legal designation of who holds evacuation authority and under what conditions. The progress is real. It is at the communication level, the messages that reached Armero's population on the night of November 13 were contradictory, incomplete, and in the specific case of the remain calm instruction, actively counterproductive. The instruction to remain calm is appropriate advice when the threat level is uncertain and the risk of panic-induced injuries during an unnecessary evacuation is high. It is the wrong instruction when a confirmed eruption of a glaciated volcano has generated a lahar that is verifiably moving toward a populated area. The two conditions require opposite responses, and the officials issuing the calm instruction did not have a decision framework that distinguished. At the political level, the post-disaster investigations and journalistic accounts document reluctance, not conspiracy, not malice, but genuine reluctance to trigger the economic and political disruption of ordering a large-scale evacuation of an economically significant city during an active agricultural harvest season, on the basis of a volcanic threat that might produce a small lahar or might produce a large one. That reluctance is human, it is understandable, and it is fatal when the hazard is real, the map is correct, and the mountain is doing exactly what the scientists said it would do. The Colombian government formally acknowledged institutional failures in the Armero disaster. Several officials faced legal proceedings in the years following 1985, though the outcomes of those proceedings were limited. More significantly, the disaster prompted comprehensive reform of Colombian civil defense and disaster management institutions, producing eventually the National Disaster Risk Management Framework that Colombia now operates under, one of the more developed in Latin America, with clear authority structures and pre-agreed trigger levels for volcanic alerts. It took 23,000 deaths to produce that framework. The framework exists. The framework is better. The same conversation is still happening at volcanoes around the world that have not yet had their Armero. After Armero, the world of volcanic hazard management changed. Not immediately, not completely, but in ways that are measurable and documented. The United Nations designated the 1990s as the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction. The specific shock of Armero, a disaster that had been predicted and still killed 25,000 people, was a significant driver of that designation. The Volcanological and Seismological Observatory of the USGS was restructured and expanded. Ingiominas itself was significantly expanded and eventually became the more robust Servicio Geológico Colombiano. The concept of a volcanic crisis communication protocol, a documented chain of authority specifying who makes the evacuation call and what information triggers it, became a standard element of volcanic emergency planning in countries with active volcanoes. Before Armero, that concept barely existed as a field of applied practice. After Armero, it became a minimum standard. The Volcano Disaster Assistance Program, created in 1986 as a joint USGS-USAID initiative specifically in response to the Armero experience, was designed to deploy rapid response volcanological teams to developing countries experiencing volcanic crises, providing both scientific expertise and, critically, assistance in translating that expertise into actionable civil emergency guidance. Its first major test came in 1991 at Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines. The joint team's monitoring and communication persuaded the Philippine government to order evacuations that removed more than 70,000 people from the highest hazard zones before the June 15, 1991 eruption, one of the largest volcanic eruptions of the 20th century. The death toll from an eruption of that scale was approximately 800 people. Pinatubo is what Armero was supposed to have been. Lahar monitoring technology advanced significantly in the years following Armero. Tripwire sensors placed in river channels and active volcanic areas detect the change in vibration caused by an approaching lahar and transmit automated alerts to downstream warning systems. Acoustic flow monitors detect the characteristic sound signature of a large debris flow moving through a channel. These systems, deployed on volcanoes including Mount Rainier in Washington State, Mount Merapi in Indonesia, and Volcan Fuego in Guatemala, give downstream communities warning times that range from minutes to tens of minutes depending on the channel geometry and flow speed. Minutes to tens of minutes, not hours. This is the honest state of lahar warning technology 4 decades after Armero. The physics of lahar transit means that warning time is fundamentally limited by the geometry of the system. A lahar originating high on a volcano and traveling fast down a river valley arrives at downstream communities before automated sensors in the channel can provide more than a few minutes of additional warning beyond what the eruption itself signals. The lesson of Armero was not that better tripwire sensors in the Lagunillas River would have saved the town. The lesson was that the warning for Armero needed to be issued not when the lahar was in the channel, but hours earlier when the eruption was beginning and the lahar was forming on the summit. That means pre-eruptive hazard assessment and pre-established community evacuation protocols are the only tools that can provide the lead time needed for communities in lahar hazard zones to evacuate safely. Sensors in river channels are useful supplementary final alerts for communities that were not evacuated preemptively. They are not a substitute for having already left. The global implications of what happened at Armero are not historical. They are present in specific and measurable ways in every country that has an active volcano above a populated river valley. Approximately 1 billion people worldwide live within reach of an active volcano. The number of people living in volcanic hazard zones has grown substantially since 1985, driven by population growth in the most volcanically active regions of the world's Southeast Asia, Central America, the East African Rift, the Pacific Ring of Fire. The combination of population growth and the fertility of volcanic soils, which supports highly productive agriculture precisely because it sits on the mineral-rich residue of prior eruptions, means that the communities most exposed to volcanic hazards are also among the most economically dependent on remaining in those locations. Mount Merapi in Indonesia is the most urgently relevant parallel. It is the most active stratovolcano in one of the most volcanically active countries in the world. It has erupted catastrophically multiple times in the past century, most recently in 2010 when a major eruption killed more than 300 people and displaced hundreds of thousands. Merapi is not a poorly monitored volcano. Indonesia has one of the most sophisticated volcanic monitoring networks in Southeast Asia, maintained by the Center for Volcanology and Geological Hazard Mitigation. Merapi is instrumented with seismometers, GPS deformation sensors, gas sensors, and camera networks. Its activity is tracked around the clock. The scientists who work on Merapi are skilled, and their records are good. Merapi also has approximately 1 million people living within 30 kilometers of its summit. The flanks of the volcano are covered with villages and small holdings whose residents grow crops in some of the most productive volcanic soil in Java. When Merapi erupts, the evacuation of communities on its slopes is enormous in scale and contested in implementation, as residents with livestock and crops resist leaving. Officials struggle with the cost and logistics of sheltering hundreds of thousands of displaced people. And the question of when to order evacuation and when to allow return is contested between scientific advisors who prioritize safety margins and local officials who balance safety against the economic and social costs of prolonged displacement. Volcan Popocatépetl in Mexico presents a version of the Armero problem at civilizational scale. Popocatépetl has been in a state of elevated and variable unrest since 1994, when it ended a 70-year period of relative quiescence and began a phase of activity that has continued for more than 3 decades. It is not dormant. It is not an emergency. It is a persistently active volcano in a state of ongoing activity that seismologists describe with the clinical understatement of heightened alert. Within 100 kilometers of its summit live more than 25 million people, including the eastern suburbs of Mexico City. The lahar pathways from Popocatépettl's glaciated summit descend through densely settled river valleys in the states of Puebla and Morelos. The hazard maps for Popocatépetl are published. The lahar hazard zones are drawn. The communities in those zones continue to grow. The Virunga volcanic field in the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo contains the most persistently active lava lake volcano in the world. Nyiragongo, situated above the city of Goma, which has a population of approximately 700,000 people. Nyiragongo erupted in 2002 and sent lava flows through Goma, killing approximately 150 people and displacing 350,000. It erupted again in 2021 in a sudden event with minimal warning, killing 32 people in the chaos and sending hundreds of thousands fleeing toward Rwanda on foot. The monitoring of Nyiragongo was interrupted by years of conflict in the Eastern Dark that made it difficult to maintain instrumentation on and around the volcano. The population's ability to evacuate is constrained by road infrastructure inadequate for the rapid movement of hundreds of thousands of people, and by a political environment in which the authority to order evacuation is contested. These are not edge cases. They are the present condition of volcanic risk in a world where more people live near active volcanoes than at any prior point in human history, where the monitoring systems have improved dramatically, and where the gap between scientific monitoring capability and institutional response capacity, the gap that killed Armero, persists at volcano after volcano, country after country. What changed after 1985, and what did not change, is the honest accounting the Armero legacy demands. The Colombian government has published revised volcanic hazard maps for Nevado del Ruiz multiple times in the decades since 1985. The volcano remains active. It has produced smaller eruptions since 1985. The communities downstream in the river valleys, some of them rebuilt after 1985. Some new remain in the Lahar hazard zones that the maps continue to show. In 2023, Nevado del Ruiz entered a period of elevated unrest that prompted the Colombian Geological Service to raise its alert level to the second highest tier. Authorities issued evacuation advisories for communities in the river valleys below. The advisories received public attention. Some communities moved, some did not. The hazard map for those communities looks very much like the one published in October 19. On the morning of November 14, 1985, aerial observers flying over the Lagunillas River Valley reported that they could not see Armero. They could see the tops of the tallest trees that had stood at the edges of the city protruding above a flat gray surface. They could see the upper walls of the cathedral, the red tile of a few rooftops on the eastern edge of the city, where the lahar had been thinner. They could see the hands of people on those rooftops, waving. Below the gray surface, there were streets and plazas and houses and schools and a market and the cotton fields at the edge of town, and 23,000 people who had been told to stay calm. The October 1985 hazard map that placed Armero in the highest risk lahar zone was later translated into Spanish and English. It was studied at university. It was cited in academic papers on volcanic risk communication. It became, in the volcanological literature, a case study in the gap between hazard assessment and hazard communication, between the map that shows the danger and the action that removes people from it. The map was not wrong. It showed precisely what happened. It showed where the lahar would go, and the lahar went there. And the people who were in the way of it were not warned in time, because the institutions between the map and the people in its highest risk zone could not close the distance. That distance is still the problem. Not the distance between the volcano and the city, the distance between the map and the decision. The scientists drew the line. They drew it 6 weeks in advance. They drew it. The line went through Armero. Nobody left. The map is still in the archive. The volcano is still active. The lesson is still waiting to be learned by every city that sits inside a hazard zone and has not yet run its first evacuation drill, has not yet identified its escape routes, has not yet decided in the calm of an ordinary day, with enough time to think what it will do when the mountain above it stops being quiet and the channel below it starts to fill. Armero was not a mystery. It was a prediction. The prediction was correct. The town was buried anyway.